Hello, it's Daryl Goodman with SCTC, which is Senior Computer Tech Center, and I'm here today with a new YouTube video, hopefully informative. Uh, I'll be talking about Linux, something you may have heard of and why it might be important to seniors. So let me start by first I'm going to do a slideshow. And after the slides, I'm going to do some demonstrations on a Linux laptop or a Linux desktop that I have. So, Linux, who, what, why, and where, all that good newspaper stuff. So, what is Linux? Well, like Windows and Mac and iOS and other systems you work with, Linux is an operating system. An operating system manages the communication between your hardware and software. Without the operating system, the software would not function. So, a little history of Linux, but first we have to talk about something called Unix. Unix goes way back into the 1960s, came out of Bell Labs, and it was largely used on mainframe systems, mid range servers, and it had only a terminal command line interface. So Linux came around in about 1991 when a Finnish student, Linus Torvalds, decided to create a new free operating system with an emphasis on free. That's going to be one of the themes of this presentation. Since then, the resulting Linux kernel has been marked by constant growth throughout its history. Linux might be best known in servers. So a lot of the servers, most of the servers that are on the internet running web browsers and that sort of thing are all Linux-based systems. However, there are also other uses. So here's a cute little cartoon. Mom, what are clouds made of? Well, mostly Linux servers. So that's the server side of Linux. However, recently, well, longer than recently, we've had desktop operating systems that run on either desktop computers or laptops, and even expanding to tablet computers, and some experimentation is going on with cell phones. So why you use Linux? And this would be from a senior user point of view. First of all, it's very secure. It runs fine on older hardware. If you're looking at a Windows or Mac system, typically we recommend a lot more memory than that, than 4 gigabyte. Typically on Windows, at least 8. We're even recommending 16 gigabyte now. Also, the operating system itself has a very small footprint that it takes up on your hard drive, less than 20 gigabytes. The operating system and all the applications that are used are free. Updates on the system run in the background with little impact to using the computer. So, and there's very few reboots needed after applying updates. So, as you probably know, Windows can have a long time to run updates and often gets in the way of you doing anything while that update is running. It's known as open source, so a lot of different people actually volunteer their time and efforts to work on the operating system and the applications that run on Linux. So why use Linux? Well, when the Windows 7 went out of support, we had the opportunity to offer users either they buy a new machine, or the other option was to let's repurpose that Windows 7 machine and put Linux on it, making it a perfectly usable laptop or desktop computer. Most Windows 7 machines had at least 4 gigabyte of memory and dual or quad core processors. So perfectly suited for running Linux. But it's all about meeting application requirements. So if you will be talking about that a little bit later. If a machine has less than 4 gigabytes, there are lightweight versions of Linux that run on lower powered machines. So what is a Linux distribution? So Linux operating system is the heart of it. It's the kernel. But on top of that is the Linux distribution. There are literally hundreds of Linux distributions, which makes choice very available in that space. Some of the more popular ones are Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and Elementary. There's lots of others. Now, under Linux Mint, I pointed out that there's different desktop environments that can be installed with Linux Mint. So they have a version that kind of targets lower end PCs. That's the XFCE version. Then there's the MATE version, and that's what I would consider middle of the road PCs in terms of performance capabilities. And then they have a version called Cinnamon, which needs pretty good graphics support. Now today, the machine I'm running is actually the Mate version of Mint. Elementary is kind of a newer one that actually kind of very much similar in look and feel to a Mac. So if you were a Mac user, Elementary might be of interest. Installing Linux is pretty easy once you have things set up to do it. We or you have to build what's called a boot DVD or USB stick. So you boot the computer that you want to install Linux into the DVD drive or the PC stick, and that allows you to get a sample of what it's going to look like if you install it, but then also offers the choice to fully install it on your PC. So you have to go to a website typically to download what they call the ISO file, ISO, and burn a DVD or a USB stick. So that has a few steps, and that might require some help from us to get those going. Installing software. Well, Linux, once you install it, has a lot of software already built in. For example, it usually has LibreOffice, which is the Linux software. Actually, LibreOffice runs on Windows and Mac also, but it's a free alternative to Microsoft Office. So it contains a word processor, a spreadsheet package, presentation package, and so on. Most Linux distributions come with the Firefox browser, although you can install other browsers. And there's music and video players that typically come bundled with the install of the software. And then, as I'll demonstrate, there are app stores where you can install other software. Once you become more experienced with Linux, you can learn to use the terminal to do terminal-based commands, but in honesty, they've made Linux to the point anymore that you don't really ever have to open the terminal to do something. Or you can download software from the web, such as the Chrome browser. You have to go to the Chrome website to download the Chrome browser. So as I mentioned, there's various flavors, and some of them have more application to certain types of users. So this cartoon kind of gives you a feel for that. The one you'll hear about a lot is something called Arch, and that's really for very experienced users and so on. So I usually recommend either Ubuntu or Linux Mint. And as you'll see, the Mint interface kind of looks similar to what you might have been used to on Windows. So how many different ways can I run Linux? Well, you can do a full install, which replaces everything on your current computer with Linux, destroying, removing all the Windows stuff and all the files and programs and so on. So you want to make sure that, of course, you back up your own data that you would want to save before doing that. You can also run a live session. So I mentioned you download what's called the ISO file to a DVD. That allows you to run the operating system from the DVD, which does not touch your computer at all. It just runs it from the DVD. Will give you an idea of how to use Linux and so on. But typically, it doesn't save anything that you do during that session. So it's not persistent in most cases. or you can do that from a bootable USB stick also. You can set up a machine that dual boots. So if you want to keep Windows and run Linux, one of the choices is dual boot. And that honestly is one of the more difficult things to set up. So definitely you would have to read a lot of material on that or work with one of us that can help you. You can run Linux also under something called virtual machines. So there's a program from Oracle called VirtualBox, which is a free program that lets you set up virtual machines on your Windows computer or your Mac computer. Typically, you have to have a pretty good amount of memory on that machine to be able to host several virtual machines underneath the host operating system. So that's the slides I wanted to talk about. So let me minimize this. So this is the desktop interface for what is called Linux Mint. So just glancing at it, you may see, well, it looks like it has a desktop where I can put shortcuts. If I right click on the mouse key on the screen, typical to Windows, it gives us choices to do things like changing the background and creating shortcuts and so on. So as we often say, right click is your friend on a mouse because it gives you more options typically than left clicking does sometimes. Then if I go to the lower left corner of the screen, you'll see a icon that says LM, and when I hover over it, it says Linux Mint 20.2, and that is the current version I'm running. So by clicking on that Start button, similar to where Windows Start button is, that lists all the different things that I can do on the computer, such as I can go to a control center, and this is where I would do all the different settings, hook up printers, do Bluetooth, change my display, work with the mouse button choices, power management, and so on. So similar to other operating systems, it has what's called a control center, excuse me. Going back to the Start menu, the other thing I want to point out here is the Software Manager. So this is the location where you go to download software that did not come with the original install. For example, Spotify, Minecraft, Skype, and so on. So there's all different kinds of free and open source software that's available to install on this Linux desktop. So by clicking on the Start, all the applications have been organized into categories. So accessories, games, graphics, internet. There's my Firefox browser. Office. I mentioned LibreOffice. So here's all the free software that comes with LibreOffice. The word type processing, the spreadsheet equivalent, and so on. And these packages work with your Microsoft Office documents. So they have the capability of opening and editing files that have been created in Microsoft Office. Then there's sound and video tools to listen and watch music, or listen to music, watch movies, and so on. This takes you to the various system tools. So anyway, what I want to point out, it's a very graphical, friendly user interface that has probably some similarity to what you're used to using in Windows. And then looking down on the bottom, these are applications that are currently running. So I have minimized those. So when I was in the slides, and when I minimize it, it goes to the bottom taskbar. Also on the far right, you can see the date and time, and these are various connectivities. So I'm on a wired internet. I can control the speaker and microphone volumes and so on. So very similar, probably very simple to use. Compared to Windows, I think Linux Mint would not be that much of a challenge for a person to learn. So we got some other resources. So as you may know, we have a website, this https bit.ly/sctc home, And I've created a tab for Linux that I'll be populating with different material to go beyond the scope of this video. And if you have specific questions, you can always email us at info@friendslongmont.org. And with that, I'll leave that up for a couple of minutes here so you can copy it, and then I'll be closing the video. Thanks for your attendance, and hopefully this gave you some useful information.